After my dad's terrible accident, he asked me to quit my job and move back home to take care of him, and I agreed right away. But when I arrived, he told me to sleep in the garage because his slacker stepdaughter was hogging the entire first floor. The very next day, I dug up this old notice Dad had completely forgotten. And oh boy, he didn't see this twist coming. So, here's the tale of how my dad's accident led to me quitting my job, moving back home and discovering just how twisted family can be. My relationship with my dad had always been strained. It wasn't always like that, but after my mom passed when I was a teenager, something shifted between us. He became distant, almost like he didn't know how to be a parent without her. For a few years, we sort of drifted along in silence until he met Tammy. Tammy was the opposite of my mom, flashy, loud and a bit controlling, but my dad seemed happy and I didn't want to stand in the way of that. Then there was Tammy's daughter, Rachel. She was a few years younger than me and never seemed to get her life together. No job lasted longer than a couple of months, and every new venture she started ended up being just another way to ask for more money from Dad. She moved in with them not long after they married, and I could feel the house changing suddenly. It wasn't my home anymore. I moved out as soon as I could, and honestly, I thought I'd escaped that chaotic mess for good. Then I got the call that changed everything. My dad had fallen down the stairs and broken his leg and wrist. It was serious. This was just an add-on to his already declining health, and he needed help with day-to-day tasks. And Tammy couldn't manage it all alone. Rachel? Nowhere to be found, of course. So who did they call? Me. The daughter who had moved on, started a stable job in the city and wasn't looking to get sucked back into their dysfunction. I didn't hesitate though. He was still my dad. I dropped everything, quit my job and packed things to go back home and help. I wasn't thrilled, but I figured it would be temporary just until Dad got back on his feet. When I arrived, I could feel the tension as soon as I stepped through the door. I wasn't expecting a hero's welcome, but some acknowledgement of the fact that I just upended my life would have been nice. Instead, Tammy barely glanced at me, too busy fiddling with some recipe in the kitchen. My dad, lying on the couch with his leg in a cast, barely said anything. I thought he might be groggy from pain meds, but as I'd come to realize later, he just didn't care. After a brief exchange where Dad gave me the bare-bones details of his injuries, I figured I'd go to my old room to settle in. But as I started to head down the hallway, Dad called out almost like an afterthought that my room wasn't available. Rachel had moved in there. I was stunned. Rachel, the perpetual leech, had claimed my room. I hadn't lived there in years, but it still felt like mine in some way. A link to a time when things weren't so messed up. Now Rachel was sleeping in it, probably with all her junk piled up. I clenched my jaw and tried to stay calm. Fine. I just take one in the other rooms. I was here to help, not to pick a fight. But of course, that wasn't the end of it. When I asked Dad where else I could stay, he told me that Rachel had taken over all the other rooms on the first floor too. 4 rooms. Rachel had her business ventures spread across every inch of that floor. Apparently, she had started some kind of project, a crafting business or something, using money Dad had lent her. The business had failed as expected, and now the entire floor was filled with the wreckage of her failed attempts at making a living. When I suggested we move some of Rachel's stuff out so I could at least have one room to sleep in, Dad told me not to bother. He suggested I stay in the garage. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The garage? Cold, damp and packed with junk? After I had just quit my job and uprooted my life to help him. But again, I kept my mouth shut. I didn't want to make a scene on the first day back, so I swallowed my pride and moved my things into the garage. It wasn't exactly unlivable, but it was far from comfortable. I found an old mattress and some blankets, but the whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with this arrangement. I was here helping, sacrificing, and yet Rachel, who had done nothing, got to live in comfort inside the house. That first night, I barely slept. I was freezing, surrounded by piles of old toolboxes and junk. My thoughts kept racing. How had I ended up in this situation? I tried to remind myself I was doing this for Dad, but it wasn't sitting right with me. Still, I told myself things would get better the next day. I talked to Dad again, explained that I needed a proper place to stay, and surely he'd understand. The next day, while Dad was napping, I decided to pass the time by going through some old boxes in the garage. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just curious. And that's when I found it, an old letter stuffed into a pile of papers. It was from the county, dated almost 5 years ago. The letter was a final notice about unpaid property taxes. According to the letter, if the taxes weren't paid soon, the house would be seized. I couldn't believe it. My dad had been letting the taxes pile up for years. How had this slipped through the cracks? I brought it to him immediately, and when he saw it, he looked shocked. He claimed he had forgotten about it, that it was supposed to be taken care of, but with everything going on, it had fallen by the wayside. That's when I realized something wasn't adding up. How could you forget something as important as losing your house? And Tammy? She brushed it off like it was no big deal. She even had the nerve to tell me to let it go and that it would all work out. Meanwhile, I was the one scrambling to figure out how to stop this disaster from happening. Over the next few days, I tried to get a handle on the situation, contacting the county and figuring out how much time we had before the house was officially seized. Tammy and Rachel, on the other hand, acted like nothing was happening. They carried on with their lives, Rachel still hogging all the rooms. Tammy going out to her yoga classes and social events. It was like I didn't exist, like my presence was just an afterthought to them, despite the fact that I was the only one trying to stop the house from being taken. But then things got even worse. While digging through more of Dad's paperwork, I stumbled across something I never expected. Evidence that Tammy had been siphoning money from Dad's accounts for years. Slowly but surely, she'd been draining his savings, funneling it into an account under her name. Rachel was in on it too, getting monthly allowances from Dad's account all without his knowledge. They had been taking advantage of him for years and he didn't even realize it. I didn't know what to do. I felt sick to my stomach. Here I was, the one person trying to help, and the people Dad had trusted were betraying him right under his nose. I had to do something, but what? And was it even my place to get involved? I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. All this time, I thought I was helping my dad, that he was the victim, but now it seemed like he was complicit in the whole thing. He let Tammy control everything, let Rachel live like a queen in my old room, and just sat back while they drained his accounts dry. And the worst part, he didn't seem to care. After Tammy's revelation, I was too stunned to speak. I just sat there trying to wrap my head around it. How could my dad be okay with this? How could he let them take over his life, his finances, everything? Tammy acted like she had done him a favor by taking control, but all I could see was a man who had given up on himself, on me, on everything. I couldn't take it anymore. I stormed out of the room, grabbed my jacket, and went for a long walk. I needed to clear my head and to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I had quit my job, put my life on hold to help him, and this was how he repaid me? By letting Tammy and Rachel walk all over him? And me? When I got back to the house that evening, things had only gotten worse. Rachel was back, lounging on the couch in the living room, surrounded by boxes of her failed business ventures. She didn't even acknowledge me as I walked in. I couldn't hold back anymore. I confronted her, demanding to know why she was hogging all the space and treating the house like her personal storage unit while I was stuck in the freezing garage. Rachel just shrugged and said that that's the arrangement they had and I should have asked before moving in, like I was some sort of guest in my own father's house. I couldn't believe the entitlement. She had completely taken over, acting like she owned the place and no one, not Dad, not Tammy, was doing anything to stop her. That night, I couldn't sleep. I had always known Rachel was lazy, but this level of audacity was something else. And Tammy, she was the puppet master behind it all, controlling Dad and making sure her daughter reaped all the benefits. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know where to start. I was one person against this twisted duo, and even my own father wasn't on my side. The next day, things escalated even further, and I decided to take matters into my own hands. If Tammy and Rachel weren't going to give me space, I'd make space. I started clearing out one of the rooms on the first floor, the one closest to my old room, which Rachel had been using as a dumping ground for her business supplies. I figured if I cleared enough junk, I could at least sleep in a proper bed and not freeze in the garage. I had barely started moving boxes when Tammy appeared furious. She demanded to know what I was doing, and when I told her I was making room for myself, she lost it. She started yelling at me, accusing me of overstepping and acting like I owned the place. I reminded her that this was my father's house and I had every right to be there, but she wouldn't back down. The shouting match escalated with Tammy threatening to call the cops if I didn't stop messing with Rachel's things. At that point, I'd had enough. I stood my ground, telling her that if anyone was going to call the cops, it would be me. I could tell the authorities all about the financial exploitation I had uncovered, about how she and Rachel were draining my dad's accounts while he sat there oblivious. Dat shut her up for a moment, but then she played her trump card, Dat. She dragged him into the argument, telling him that I was trying to destroy their family by causing trouble. And here's the part that still stings the most. Dad took her side. He told me to stop making things difficult and that I should respect Tammy and Rachel because they had been there for him while I abandoned the family to go live in the city. I couldn't believe it. After everything I had done, after dropping my life to come and help him, this was how he saw me? The daughter who abandoned him? I was livid. I packed my things and I left the house for the rest of the day, just driving around aimlessly trying to cool down. When I got back later that night, I found out that Tammy had moved some of Rachel's things into the garage, my temporary living space. It was like they were trying to push me out altogether, slowly but surely. That night, I decided to take another look at the financial papers I had found. Something wasn't adding up. If Tammy had been draining Dad's account for so long, Where had all the money gone? I started digging through more of Dad's records, and that's when I uncovered the truth. Tammy had been funneling a large portion of the money into a separate account in Rachel's name. The account had thousands of dollars in it, money that should have been used for Dad's care, for the house, for anything other than supporting Rachel's failed business ventures. I knew I couldn't keep quiet about this anymore. This wasn't just about me sleeping in a garage or Rachel taking over my room. This was full-on financial abuse. But how could I get Dad to see it? He was so deep under Tammy's control that I wasn't sure he'd believe me, even if I showed him the evidence. I thought about contacting a lawyer, but that felt too extreme. After all, this was still my family, as messed up as they were. I didn't want to destroy what little relationship I had left with my dad, but I also couldn't stand by and watch them ruin his life any longer. I decided I needed to be strategic about this. I started making copies of all the documents I found, bank statements, transaction records, everything. I wasn't going to confront them just yet, but I was preparing for the moment when I would, and that moment was coming soon, whether they knew it or not. I had to act. I gathered all the evidence I had collected and sat down with Dad again. This time laying everything out in front of him. Every shady transaction, every dollar Tammy had siphoned off, every failed business Rachel had used as an excuse to bleed him dry. I even told him about the conversation I'd overheard about selling the house. But Dad's response was heartbreaking. He refused to believe it. He said I was blowing things out of proportion, that Tammy loved him and would never do something like that. He accused me of trying to drive a wedge between him and Tammy, of being jealous because I hadn't been part of the family for so long. I was at my breaking point. I told him that if he didn't wake up soon, he was going to lose everything. His house, his savings, and maybe even me. I couldn't keep putting myself in the middle of this mess if he wasn't willing to help himself. I thought that might get through to him, but he just stared at me silent as if he didn't recognize me anymore. I don't know what to do now. Part of me wants to walk away to let them deal with the consequences of their actions, but another part of me can't just leave my dad to be taken advantage of like this. I'm stuck in this impossible situation. No matter what I do, it feels like I'm going to lose. So, Reddit, either for trying to step in and fix this mess, or should I just let it go and let them handle the fallout themselves? Update 1. Hey, everyone. I just want to start by saying thank you for all the overwhelming support and responses to my last post. I've been trying to keep up with all the advice and comments, but, honestly, it's been a whirlwind. I'm barely holding it together. You guys have no idea how much your words have meant to me. It feels like you're the only ones in my corner right now. After my last conversation with Dad, I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer. It was suffocating. Every time I looked at Rachel lounging around or Tammy acting like she owned the place, my blood would boil. But the worst part was seeing my dad just sitting there, letting them drain everything he and my mom had worked so hard to build. I knew deep down I had done everything I could to help him, but it was clear he didn't want to help himself. It was time for me to step back, at least for my own sanity. So I packed the bag and left. I didn't have a plan. I just needed to get out of there. I've been staying with a friend in the city trying to figure out my next move. But even though I physically left that house, my mind has been stuck there. The guilt of leaving Dad behind, even though I know I tried my best, has been eating me alive. But I knew I had to get someone else involved, someone Dad might actually listen to since he clearly wasn't listening to me. That's when I decided to call my uncle, Dad's younger brother. My uncle has always been the practical one in the family. He's never been a fan of Tammy's. He's been suspicious of her from the start, and I figured if anyone could knock some sense into Dad, it would be him. I explained everything to him. How Tammy and Rachel had taken over and how Dad was oblivious to the financial mess they were creating. My uncle was furious. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, and he promised he'd drive down and talk to Dad himself. A few days passed and I was anxiously waiting to hear back. I got a text from my cousin saying my uncle was on his way to the house and I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the turning point. Maybe if Dad saw that it wasn't just me, if someone else he trusted told him what was going on, he'd finally wake up and take action. But when my uncle arrived at the house, things didn't go as planned. Apparently Tammy and Rachel refused to let him in. My cousin texted me updates in real time and I could hardly believe what I was reading. Tammy had come to the door and immediately started acting more defensive, telling my uncle that Dad was resting and couldn't handle visitors right now. She went on and on about how Dad was fragile, how he needed peace and quiet, and how they were taking care of him. My uncle wasn't having it. He told them he wasn't leaving until he saw his brother. That's when Rachel came out of nowhere backing Tammy up. They both started ganging up on him, telling him to leave and that Dad didn't need any family drama right now. My uncle tried to push past them saying he was just there to talk, but they physically blocked the doorway, refused to let him in. They even threatened to call the police if he didn't leave. He didn't want to escalate the situation in front of Dad, especially if Dad really was resting. So reluctantly, he left. But before he drove off, he told them that this wasn't over. He said he'd be back with legal action if necessary. When I got that message from my cousin, I felt my heart sink. If my own uncle couldn't even get through to Dad, what hope did I have? Later that night, my uncle called me. He was livid. He told me that the whole situation was fishy, how Tammy and Rachel were acting so defensive, almost like they were hiding something. He said that the fact they wouldn't even let him see Dad raised all kinds of red flags. I agreed. I mean, what were they afraid of? Why were they keeping Dad isolated from the rest of the family? That conversation left me even more uneasy. Something wasn't right. I had been so focused on Tammy and Rachel bleeding Dad dry financially that I hadn't really considered there might be something more sinister going on. My uncle seemed to think they were keeping Dad deliberately isolated, maybe even manipulating him into staying dependent on them. The thought made me sick. Over the next few days, I tried calling Dad several times, but I could never get through to him. Tammy always picked up with some excuse about how he was too tired or too busy resting. It didn't make sense. I started to worry that maybe Dad wasn't okay, physically or mentally. I had no idea what they were telling him or if he was even aware of what was happening around him. Finally, my cousin, who's a lawyer, suggested we start looking into options for legal intervention. He told me that if Tammy really was keeping Dad isolated and controlling his finances, we might be able to get a conservatorship or guardianship in place, especially if we could prove that Dad wasn't in a position to make decisions for himself anymore. The problem was that we didn't have enough evidence. Everything I had was circumstantial, my word against theirs. Still, I started keeping track of every interaction I had with Tammy, Rachel, and Dad, or at least the few interactions I was allowed to have. Every time they blocked my calls or made some excuse for why Dad couldn't talk to me, I made a note of it. I knew I needed to gather as much as I could, if I had any chance of getting legal help. And then, out of nowhere, I got a text from Rachel. It was short and passive-aggressive, typical of her. She basically told me to stop stirring up trouble and to respect Dad's wishes. She claimed Dad didn't want to see me because I was causing stress and making things worse for him. The text made my blood boil. It was clear she was manipulating the situation, trying to paint me as the villain while she and her mother continued to pull the strings behind the scenes. But what really got me was the way she phrased things. She kept saying, "We have Dad's best interests at heart, and we know what's best for him." It was like she had completely taken over, speaking for him as if he didn't have a voice of his own anymore. That was the moment I knew for sure that something deeper was going on. They weren't just taking his money, they were taking his autonomy, his ability to make decisions for himself. I still haven't spoken to Dad directly since I left. Every time I think about it, it breaks my heart. I just hope we can reach him before it's too late. Whatever Tammy and Rachel are up to, I'm not going to let them get away with it. I'll keep you guys updated as things develop. Thanks again for all the support. I really need it right now. Update 2. After the last few days of chaos, my uncle and I decided it was time to take more drastic action. He was as furious as I was about how Rachel and Tammy were isolating my dad and refusing to let anyone in to see him. We'd already tried reasoning with them, but it was clear they were playing some kind of twisted game, and I was terrified that if we didn't act soon, Dad would only get worse. So Uncle made a few calls, and the next day, we planned another visit to Dad's house. This time with one of his lawyer friends. We weren't trying to stir up a full-on legal battle just yet, but we wanted to send a clear message. We were serious. We weren't going to back down. If Tammy and Rachel thought they could keep Dad isolated forever, they had another thing coming. When we arrived at the house, it was déjà vu, just like last time. Tammy and Rachel answered the door already on edge. You could see it in their eyes. They weren't expecting us to show up again so soon. Tammy immediately launched into the same old spiel about how Dad was resting, and it wasn't a good time for visitors. But my uncle cut her off before she could even finish. This time, he told them he wasn't alone and motioned towards his lawyer friend who was standing right behind him, and that's when things shifted. Rachel's face changed instantly. She knew we weren't just bluffing. Uncle told them that if they didn't let us see Dad right then and there, we would escalate things legally. He made it clear that we were prepared to go to court if they kept blocking access to him. Tammy looked panicked, and Rachel, usually the more composed one, actually faltered. They were backed into a corner, and they knew it. After a tense few seconds of silence, Rachel reluctantly stepped aside and let us in. The second I walked into the house, I felt like I had stepped into a nightmare. First thing I noticed was how dark and stale the air felt, like the windows hadn't been opened in days. Then I saw Dad. He was slumped in his favorite chair, but he was barely recognizable. His once strong frame had become frail and he looked so much worse than when I last saw him. He wasn't just recovering from his injuries anymore, he looked sick, really sick. His skin was pale and clammy, his eyes dull, and there was this vacant, tired look on his face that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't just his physical health that concerned me though. Dad seemed completely disoriented. He didn't even react when he saw us walk in. It was like he didn't fully register that we were there. My heart sank. This wasn't just about a broken leg or wrist anymore. Something was deeply wrong, and it was clear that Tammy and Rachel had been hiding it from us. I had a horrible feeling they'd been neglecting him this whole time, and my suspicions grew stronger the longer I looked at him. I lost it. I couldn't hold back anymore. I just snapped. I turned to Tammy and Rachel, my voice shaking with rage, and I called them out for what they were doing. I told them I knew exactly what was going on, that they were using Dad for his money, draining everything he had, and that they were willing to let him rot in that chair just to keep control of his assets. I couldn't believe how far they'd let this go, and I wasn't going to stand by and watch them destroy my father for their own selfish benefit. They tried to defend themselves, of course. Tammy gave some excuse about how Dad needed rest, and they were doing everything they could to care for him. Rachel jumped in with her usual nonsense about how she had been helping with his recovery, but I was done listening to their lies. I cut them off mid-sentence, telling them that I didn't care what excuses they had. It was over. I told them that I wanted them out of the house by the end of the day. I didn't care what they had to say. It was Dad's house and only his. Nothing in that house belonged to them except for the junk they had scattered around. The moment those words left my mouth, Rachel's face twisted with anger. She argued back, saying that it was their house too, and they had every right to be there, but I wasn't having any of it. I stood my ground and told them that I didn't care what they thought. They were leeching off my father, and I wasn't going to let it happen any longer. Tammy tried to play the victim, whining about how they had nowhere else to go and that they were doing their best, but it was clear that this was all just an act. I had heard enough. I turned to my uncle, and his lawyer friend nodded in agreement. It was time to get them out, one way or another. My uncle made it clear that we had enough evidence to take this to court if they didn't leave voluntarily, and that they could either pack up and leave quietly, or we'd get the law involved and drag them out. The room went silent after that. Rachel glared at me, her face flushed with anger, but she knew she had no choice. They were backed into a corner with no way out. Tammy, still trying to keep up her fake persona, muttered something under her breath and stormed out of the room. I knew they wouldn't go down without a fight, but for the first time I felt like we had the upper hand. After a few tense moments, I turned back to Dad. He hadn't said a word during the whole exchange. He looked so weak, so unlike the man I grew up with, and it broke my heart to see him like that. I knelt down beside him gently, asking if he was okay, but he barely responded. It was like he was slipping away mentally and physically. I had no idea how long this had been going on, but it was clear that if we hadn't stepped in when we did, things could have gotten even worse. Before we left, Uncle told Tammy and Rachel that they had until the end of the day to pack up their things and leave. If they were still there by evening, we'd be back with police and legal papers. As we left the house, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. I knew we'd finally made progress, but at what cost? Dad was a shell of the person he used to be, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were too late. We drove back to my uncle's house in silence, and there was still so much to process, but at least now we had a plan. I wasn't going to let Tammy and Rachel get away with this, and I knew we were closer than ever to getting them out of Dad's life for good. I'll keep you all posted on what happens next, but for now, I just need some time to recover from everything. Thank you again for all the support. It means the world to me knowing that I'm not alone in this fight. Update 3. Hey, everyone. I just wanted to give you all another update after everything that's gone down over the past week. Your support has been a huge help, and I really appreciate everyone who's been following this wild journey. So after that intense argument with Tammy and Rachel a few days ago, they actually left the house that same day. I'm guessing they were scared off by the legal threat my uncle and his lawyer friend threw at them. There was no dramatic scene when they packed up and left. No final words exchanged. I got back to the house later that evening, and by then, they were already gone. Since they left, I've moved back in with Dad to take care of him. It's been an adjustment for both of us. He's doing better health-wise, but I don't think he fully approves of how I handled things with Tammy and Rachel. I can tell there's a part of him that's conflicted. He knows they weren't good for him, but I think he still feels guilty about them being gone. It's complicated, and it's not like we've had any deep conversations about it, but I can sense his unease. But at the end of the day, he's the one who asked me to come back and take care of him. And given the state he was in, I didn't see any other option. I had to make sure he was safe, even if it meant throwing out his wife and stepdaughter. My uncle has been a huge help during all of this. He's tried talking sense into Dad, reminding him that Tammy and Rachel were taking advantage of him and that we did the right thing by stepping in. Still, Dad's stubborn. He's always had a soft spot for Tammy, and I think that's what's making this so hard for him. But little by little, he's starting to come around. It's been tough, but I'm doing my best to focus on his recovery and keep things stable around here. Speaking of Tammy and Rachel, we haven't heard from them since they left. They've completely disappeared off the radar. At first, I was worried they tried to come back or stir up more drama, but it's been radio silence. I don't know where they went, and, honestly, I don't care. As long as they stay away from Dad in the house, I'll be content. Oh, I almost forgot. After they left, we started clearing out the house. It was a complete mess. Rachel had left all her junk scattered across the first floor and it took days to sort through it. But while we were cleaning we found something shocking. Proof that they were planning to sell our house. We stumbled across some paperwork hidden in one of the piles of stuff Rachel left behind, and it outlined a plan to put the house on the market. It's clear they were trying to get their hands on whatever money they could, probably while Dad was still incapacitated from his injuries. Finding that just confirmed everything I had suspected. They were willing to sell our family home right out from under us. It's terrifying to think how close they came to pulling it off. I'm just thankful we got them out of the house when we did. I can only hope this is a lesson for them and that they're gone for good. They took enough from Dad already and I'm not going to let them get anywhere near him or the house again. As for myself, I've been trying to figure out what my next steps are. I've decided to look for a job closer to home so I can be here for Dad. It's not what I originally planned, but right now, it's what needs to happen. Dad's doing better, but he's still not fully back to his old self, and I want to make sure he gets the care he needs. I'm also in the process of hiring a nurse to help out with his day-to-day care. I want to make sure he's getting proper attention, especially when I'm not around. It's been a lot to handle, but I'm confident that things are moving in the right direction. Anyway, that's where things stand right now. I'm exhausted, but I feel like we've turned a corner.